Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Sasha Chan, and I'm part of the marketing team at CityBase. CityBase is a government technology company that transforms the ways cities connect and do business with constituents. CityBase works with local governments, agencies, and utilities to integrate payment functionality, business processes, and communications onto a central cloud-based platform that consumers can access through the web, mobile, kiosk, or point of sale. Today, we are presenting a practical guide to improving content and digital services presented by Gregory Bartlett, Solutions Engineer Lead at CityBase, and Tiffany Kwok, Content Strategist at CityBase. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box by clicking on the Ask a Question button on the left-hand corner of your screen. We have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Tiffany Kwok, Content Strategist at CityBase.
We will now walk through some basic content design principles. We will also share tips that can help you think about different ways that content strategy can improve your constituent-facing website. We understand that redeveloping websites can be extremely overwhelming. Between coming up with a content strategy, auditing your site, and finding content writers, it is important work that can often feel like a Sisyphean task. Breaking down your content development project into phases will help you manage the project successfully. Organizing your project around the content development cycle shown here can help arrange your project into clear, distinct phases. This is especially helpful if your organization does not already have clear processes around content development. The content development lifecycle is a common tool used in content strategy practices, and it can help you think about new ways in which you can categorize your own content development needs. There are a number of reasons why you could be undertaking a website redesign. You may be trying to update a website that has not been updated in 10 years, or after reviewing site analytics data, you may be looking to increase the number of constituent interactions with your site. A clear project goal will help inform the content strategy, which will ultimately guide your project throughout each phase shown here. Once you set your project goal, you'll be able to refer to it at each step of the process and bring more confidence around the content development process. Before you can dive into creating new content, however, you need to know what content you are going to keep or delete. You can conduct this type of analysis through the content audit. The content audit should occur after you inventory all content that is live on your website. A common way to inventory all content live on your site would be to use any existing site content maps to create a list of content organized by agency or department. Once you have an inventory of all content, each existing page will need to be reviewed and analyzed to understand what can be removed or repurposed. A common type of analysis used in content strategy circles is the ROT analysis. ROT stands for redundant, outdated, and trivial content. Specifically, redundant content refers to pages that have the same or similar content. You will have to think about whether or not pages with same or similar content can be consolidated or rewritten into one concise page. You may see redundant content across many different agencies or the same content multiple times on the same page. All of these examples count as redundant content. Next, outdated content refers to pages that include information that is out of date, expired, or no longer relevant. Common types under this category include pages that have application deadlines, staff contact information, information related to laws and ordinances, and more. Lastly, trivial content is the hardest to define because it is incredibly subjective. Every agency may define trivial content differently. As such, it is important to create a baseline understanding of what constitutes trivial content before the content audit begins, so that every agency is reviewing content using the same and consistent criteria. Generally, trivial content refers to content that is of little value or use to those who may be navigating the web pages. Pages that do not get clicked on can count as trivial content, or content that provides little information for the user to take any action. Blank pages, pages with very sparse content, or pages of irrelevant content can also count as trivial content. Some additional items to note as you conduct your content audit are links, files such as PDFs and other documents, media files such as videos or photos, and Google Analytics data. So after each agency or department has completed their content audit, you'll be able to understand content gaps and start creating new content. Writing and editing workflows are very important at this stage. To help ground your content development process, you can think about how your new content meets the following 3 criteria. First is readability. A study conducted by the Nielsen-Norman Group found that people who browse websites only read about 28% of the content on any given page. As such, it's important to make sure that your content is written to cater to all constituents of all types and reading levels. Next is accessibility. Make sure that your website complies with any web accessibility requirements so that users of all types can find the information they need. Last is reliability. Make sure that content writers and editors follow a clear editing guide and that content is being reviewed consistently across all levels. Content should be presented in a dependable tone across the entire site to build trust with the constituents who are interacting with your site. Finally, after all of your hard work strategizing and creating fresh content, you will have content that is ready to publish. You should follow an editorial process that allows for continuous review of content, even after publishing. Note that not all content is created equal, and some content may need to be updated more often than others. For example, if your Parks and Recreation department has summer concerts in different neighborhood parks, this information would need to be taken down during the winter months and updated with new information during the summer months. Continue to hold your content writers and editors to content approval processes and improve these processes as necessary. If you find that your content review process is too slow, implement faster turnaround timeframes for departments. Don't let your hard work fall to the wayside. By sticking to an editorial calendar with an easy-to-manage workflow for content approval and publishing, you'll be able to provide content that appeals to all of your constituents. And with that, I will now pass the mic to Greg, who will talk more about digital services.
Thanks, Tiffany. This is Greg Bartlett, Solution Engineer Lead for CityBase, and I was going to talk to you a little about digital services. It shares a lot of the same similarities and expectations of user experience as content, and then we're going to go ahead here and define digital services. So the city, county governments, and utilities, everyone's got different kinds of services. We're generally trying to digitize them if they're not digitized, and if they're already digitized, there are room for improvement. If you think about it, there's different services such as request a pothole or report a pothole, request police reports, more detailed things such as campaign search, finance. If you think about it, the point of the government is to provide services for the constituents. And now with all the digital natives that are out there, mobile devices in everyone's hands, there's an increased expectations of accessing digital services in a very clean, fast environment, low bandwidth and things like that. And we're going to talk about, how we're going to automate some of those, what we typically see, and also, implementing things such as payment technologies, because that is also another expectation now. People are used to shopping, paying for things online. Why can't you do that with a government service that you might owe an obligation or debt? We try to break down the digital services into a series of actions. So we take some, very high-level abstract verbs, such as, submit, request, apply, search, and pay, like Tiffany was speaking of. And a lot of times that can be used for things like filters. So if a user is actually, engaging with your government website, they're going to think about it in those, I'm going to apply for something, I'm going to try to learn something to, meet my needs as a constituent or my obligations as a constituent. Here on this slide, we're showing you what happens with the I want to, which is a common type of action, and then we're using it as a filter. So it would then return a number of cards that are available for the services that are the services that they're trying to engage with. So much like we do with the content, we've got a digital service auditing portion. And obviously a government website is actually made up of numerous digital services spread across and non-digital services spread across all the different agencies, departments. In some cases there are state and county level obligations that might be interacted with at your website. During the content audit, it's a great opportunity to keep track of the digital services that might already exist. A lot of times the content that exists is referencing a link, a form, a PDF, like Tiffany was stating. And as you walk through doing the content audit, you can figure out if it is a digital service or even a non-digital service. There might be a blurb that says, hey, come down to, this countertop in this office at this building to submit this paperwork. We've all been there where, we felt like this should be a little bit easier to, fulfill the obligations that we have working with the government. One other thing that you'll need to do is engage with the agencies. What is available online isn't necessarily easily found. They might not have the content for it. It might be some random link. It might be actually a piece of paper sitting in the office. And a lot of times, you might not even know that some services are available. Some interesting anecdotes about that is, we discovered at an agency that you could actually request, waivers for late fees and penalties, and that's a great opportunity to create, positive interaction with the constituents. And nobody was really aware about it until they went down to the counter to actually discuss it in person, and they were offered that option. So one thing is, after you've completed your audit, there's a number of different ways to prioritize where you're going to expend your energy. Just like any business, the government has limited resources, and you're trying to get the most bang for your buck. A lot of times, we create a set of guiding principles on where to apply the different energies to implement some of these, and there's some very high-level ones that can really inform, where that energy should go. One of the big ones is, serving the underserved. A lot of times, those underserved in the community could be forgotten about, and, you could make their life easier because they might not be able to get off work. They might be engaging in contentious type issues with the government, such as, parking violations or, having to use something like an inmate lookup. Another one would be a high-impact service, such as deductions, so making mortgage and homestead type deductions and other things like that. That obviously puts more money in people's pockets. It creates a positive interaction with the government. It serves property owners in the community. There are also business community interests, requests for proposals in the bidding process. Those are prime candidates that meet that category. Improvement in public safety is obviously another big one. Requesting extra patrols, filing traffic complaints, being able to pay traffic tickets and things like that. Collecting debts quicker in general, is everyone's benefit. The constituent, obviously, if they pay the debt sooner rather than later, late fees are not incurred, and then the government will actually get the money sooner to square up the debts. And obviously, the more channels and abilities you have for them to do that, and the awareness you can make for them, they obviously will be incentivized to pay quicker. And then there's another one, government transparency. So a big part of engaging with the community is being a transparent government. You'll have things like search for campaign finance reports, city-county proposals, items like that can increase the government transparency. On top of the guiding principles, there are other considerations that can be taken into account. When we're digitizing services or improving an existing digital service, there are opportunities to increase the labor savings. So can we refine the process? Can we make sure that the agency doesn't have to interact with inaccurately filled out forms or forms that they aren't qualified for? Obviously, anytime a submission comes in and somebody has to deal with it and it's a non-qualified submission, that's just extra labor that is spent. There's also seasonality considerations. So if you got a property tax deadline or a deduction deadline, typically the agencies see a massive increase in traffic to their facilities, and then the counter employees have to handle those personally. Volume, obviously, the larger number of transactions involved with these submissions, you get more ROI for any energy that you invest in this. And some of the more contentious items, you get into media interest, like parking is a great example where, the local media might be researching people complaining about parking tickets, and then, finding ways to improve that. Contested parking citation, for example, is a great way to, show some movement and resolve media's particular interest in something. You also do get into like a fairness. So, is it a contentious type situation with the parking or penalties, and then providing an opportunity for constituents to exercise their legal rights. They have rights to, administration hearings to contest things and protest. And obviously, if we make that simpler for them, they'll feel it's more fair, and you'll have a decrease in theory, administration hearings and other workloads as it goes through the natural digital process. The other big one is a facility load. So, when you have a whole bunch of individuals consuming services in person, you've got elevator usage, people have to find local parking, and if you're building this secure, you'll actually have security resources, X-ray machines, and all that actually limits the volume and creates frustration. Some of the governments we've worked with are actually taking into account the digitization and the improvement of these digital services when they're scheduling out their facility moves and their facility improvements, knowing that they'll have less traffic because of what we're doing with these websites. Then the other big one is non-digital constituent impacts, where you get into, if I have to print something out, do I have access to a printer? Do I have to go to a library? Do I have to pay for stamps? Do I have to take time off work? And then there's the inherent risk of you got to take time off work. Is there free parking? What happens if you get a ticket and then you have to, possibly contest the ticket? And overall, we do try to have a constituent-centric view of some of these things and the overall totality, impact of, what it takes for a user. Okay, so next we're going to talk about improving the UX consistency. We're going to implement diverse digital services so they have similar user experiences. They should also have the same functionality and similar user experiences across desktop, mobile, and tablet. So currently we're seeing more and more mobile usage. Obviously there's a very high mobile phone usage, and in fact it's across all the demographics now. We're seeing as high as 65 to 80%, depending on the digital activity for mobile in particular, which is really encouraging. One of the big things that we try to do is make sure that anything that we do from a mobile device works all the way up to desktop, and we do that through something called responsive design, where as the screen shrinks, it'll actually provide the same functionality. And then the other big thing we do is, if you think about where we're at with the digital activities in the entire ecosystem, you could have a digital service implemented across a standalone portal that's provided by a third-party vendor. You could have a digital service provided by a typical like Google or a job form. You could have digital services provided by PDF. And one thing that we want to try to do is make all of those interactions as similar as possible for consistency's sake. So each agency would have a very common usage set, design and style. For example, we try to create the branding, the color scheme, the fonts. When you get into actual forum inputs, the field naming conventions, the label above a field such as first name, separating the first name and last name so that it's always a secondary input for that, creating that consistency across everything does make it easier for individuals to interact with the government. We do try to create a typical workflow for the input screen. So as they type in information to a screen, they can click a next button that would allow them to review before they submit. This will cut down on inaccurate submissions. This would cut down on any delays in the further processing. And then we try to provide confirmations. So, just like you go across the counter, you might get a receipt in person from the countertop. We try to give email confirmations. We try to give the same, some sort of physical result from that submission. And then, having consistent buttons and error messages, clearly defined error messages that tell them the details when they have invalid inputs. And going back to the different devices, we try to make sure that, even though it's a different device, all of those still stay the same. Error messages in particular on a mobile screen, you want to make sure that it doesn't block functionality and it's clearly visible. And then we wanted to talk about a number of small changes across a large number of forms that can make a big difference. The input elements in general, trying to group them together, as well as, the data information grouping. So you'll have, say, for instance, a list view, a list of different items. You want to have that look fairly consistent and also have the columns order in a least importance to, or most importance to least importance way. There are exceptions to what we can do on the fields, because you've got legal terms and agency-specific items. So a great example would be, you know, something like an objective appeal. You know, there are very legal terms related to what that form is supposed to do because it's a state level form, and that state level form will have a governing body above it. And with that said, I'm actually going to walk through the objective appeal form on that. So this is an objective appeal form, and I'm going to describe the different user experience enhancements that we specialize here at CityBase. And the first one I want to start with was qualifying questions. As you can see here, there's 2 questions at the beginning. These dictate whether or not this form is applicable to a user. This particular form was brought up and had the qualifying questions because a large number of home leasers were appealing the property taxes so they would get lower rents. And they do not have standing to do that. The secondary question here, do you own the property or are you buying it under recorded contract? If they click no, that is going to go and give them what we call a soft stop. We still allow them to fill out this form if they were to continue, but we do inform them that, you know, they must own the property to bind on a recorded contract. The other big one is, you know, what we call a soft redirection. So that top question about, you know, is it a clerical error? That's a very particular kind of objective or appeal called an objective appeal. And if they click no, they will actually do what's called a soft redirection so that they could then go and file a subjective appeal, because a subjective appeal would meet their needs and be applicable to their circumstance. And this is a typical thing where, you know, during our analysis and audit of this digital service, you know, that was the #1 complaint of people are filing objective appeals when in fact they should be filing subjective appeals. Another particular I wanted to walk through for enhancement is the use of a data source for lookup. So a great example here is as you type into this property address, it will select a complete address from a data source. So the property tax system for this website has all the information such as the owner's names and the different parcels. These objective appeals are actually tied to a parcel ID. The idea here is that most users don't actually know their parcel ID. They would have to go and find a number of tax documents that might have the unique 7 digits. This allows them to quickly input the address with only about 8 characters and then select it, and then they can move on further through the process. The other item that we're showing here in the property information group is related to a lifeline. So the text above the property address provides them a route if they don't find this data lookup. So like any source system, we do not always have perfect up-to-date data. Properties could be transferred, addresses can actually be changed, parcel IDs can be combined, and there are a couple times a month somebody will email this GIS address and then get additional assistance. And one other one I wanted to talk about was reducing the cognitive load by displaying or hiding different inputs. So in this authorized representative question, is the property owner the person submitting this form? If they click no, they will be prompted with additional questions. Are you an authorized representative? If they click no on this, this is another demonstration of a soft stop where we're informing them that they do need these documents. Typically, we would have people that were just relatives, for example, that were trying to submit these on their behalf, but there's actually a very legalese version of what makes somebody an authorized representative or not. And if they click yes, it will go and show some supporting documentation prompts and have them provide additional information. And this makes it really easy and uncluttered when they're especially filling this out on a mobile device. Okay, so there are some potential limitations when you go about implementing digital services or improving existing digital services, and that has to do with the ability to change the design and style. So depending on what systems you have in place that are actually implementing the digital services, they might allow you to do complex styles. They might allow you to change the colors and the fonts. They might allow you to reorder the fields. If you have an existing property tax management system, for example, it might just be a one-size-fits-all. So you will be limited on the reorderings and the removal of fields. In some cases, you would be looking for data sources that can provide information to cut down the inaccuracies. And depending on the quality of that data source, or if it is actually available, or in some cases some performance, it might be possible to use it. It might not. Obviously, in this digital age, and most government systems do have some data sets. There's a lot of opportunities to connect to those through what's called APIs, application programming interfaces. And a lot of times we'll reach out to vendors and we'll actually discover that there is a data source sitting out there, and we can go ahead and use it for a small fee, or they might need to upgrade a version of the system. We are seeing more and more vendors that are improving their systems for these kinds of integrations, because it's a very common practice to provide this data and knowing that everything on the back end. The other big sticking point is related to how far you can upgrade these forms, and how does that impact other processes. So with the other process, the form submission is just one small portion of the entire process. On top of that, somebody does some processing on the back end. In some cases, there's a very particular governed route. For example, an appeal will go to a county level type situation in the state of Indiana, then it can go up to the state. So you do have to be cognizant of how much you can change, because fields could not be subtracted off of a digital service like that, because when it gets sent to the state level, they would expect the form, the particular state form to be filled out in its entirety. So in those cases, we can add additional questions, for example, to make processing easier, but we can't actually remove stuff, and we can't actually change the back-end process. It has to go through a state-mandated board and things like that. In other cases, if it's a very particular one-off process, we can go ahead and reimagine the entire activity, knowing that downstream in the back office that they're not going to have a problem changing their processes. And the other thing, and we touched on a little bit, was agency-specific terminology. A great example is a parking ticket is actually a parking citation. In some cases, we have to specifically put citation there, which from a content standpoint might not be the best terminology, because people are looking for a ticket number, not a citation number. In those cases, we do have to keep it as a citation number, but we also rely on the physical ticket to have citation on it and provide that context and provide that link. And that's a great segue into how a digital service and content intersect. And I'm going to walk through that process as well on my screen share. So every digital service will have a piece of content for it. So going back to some of those actions, this would be a submission, and this is an example of the content that sits in front of the actual digital activity or the digital service. And what happens here is this provides the context. This provides an overall instructions in some cases, and also limitations. You can see here on this line, it says you have 3 years from the date of assessment to file this type of appeal. You do get into issues where there might be some media interest in something, and a whole bunch of people will come in and try to submit appeals, and it turns out that they're past due. The other portion of this content is it can provide frequently asked question type responses, and just overall improve the accuracy of the digital service. One other item here at the bottom, it also provides a redirection to a subjective appeal, which is another kind of assessment. So the theory being that as they read through this, they realize that the subjective appeal isn't statistical processing error, that they actually do want a subjective service, and that prevents them from going into the actual digital service and getting the soft redirection. Additionally, further down here, we do have related items that can group some of these different pieces of content associated with digital services together. and that provides quick navigation between the different related activities, and also helps them discover additional activities that they may not know they're aware of. A great example would be related to deductions. You've got a mortgage and homestead, but you could also have a blind, disabled, or veteran deduction that constituents might not be aware of.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg and Tiffany. We're now at the Q&A section of our presentation. So as a reminder, if you have not already done so, please type your questions into the box by clicking on the Ask a Question button on the left-hand corner of your screen. We will try to get through as many questions as we can, but if we don't, we'll be sure to address them after the webinar. Just looking through here, this is open floor for Greg or Tiffany or both. What are some of the challenges you see when trying to digitize your services?
I'd say one of the biggest challenges I have is related to the process change and trying to keep all of the channels very similar. So when we try to digitize a service, or when we do digitize a service, you do run into the issue of there's still always going to be a non-digital channel. People still have the ability and the right to go to the office and speak with somebody from the auditor's office and hand submit something. So not only are we digitizing and putting it on the web for everyone to submit, we have to make sure that we might update a hard copy form, and that might create additional two different paths of processing, because one remains entirely in their property management system, for example, and then the other is a hard copy that has to be file cabineted, moved across desks, or possibly digitized. So that's probably the biggest one, is the overall change in the channel parity.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, making sure that the content that sits in front of that digital service is also super important, and to make sure that the tone matches what's on the form too, and all the verbiage and everything. But also there can be some resistance to wanting to put forms online, because I think it's just easier to have PDFs. But at the end of the day, you'll have a ton of PDFs, and so it's kind of this making sure that you are changing the mindset to making sure that people understand this is an improvement, and that it doesn't have to be difficult. It can be pretty easy to kind of just dip your toe in the water and then to fully dive into it.
On that note, how can you ensure constituent adoption?
That is a great question. I think it's super important to have stakeholders who understand the importance of creating this digital space and ensuring that that you do care about content and digital services and what that means for service delivery in 2019 and moving on. I think that's been key for us, is making sure that we have stakeholders who understand our values, and also know that if this needs to be addressed at some point, and better now than later.
Yeah, and there are additional things that you can do because it is on the web. We do have clients that put digital marketing behind some of this. They also have billboards and things like that, where it is creating awareness. There is media interest in what we're doing at some of these cities, because it's improving everyone's lives. It's a great story. The government is working. That's something we're demonstrating with the governments we work with. The other big one is actually informing and training some of the agency and department employees. There's a way to communicate this when people ask questions on the phone. I mean, you'd be surprised how many times it's why are people submitting this hard copy across the counter, and it turns out that nobody really informed all of the workers necessarily, or we printed out things on countertops and say, hey, you can go to this new website, complete this. They do increase, anytime there's a touch point, such as a mailing of property tax related information that happens yearly, they use that opportunity to reinforce what's available. So you can pay your property taxes here online, and when they go there, the digital content related activities will show them other opportunities, and quickly they self-discover through that there's a lot of improvement on the website. You do run into the typical issue of they were used to an old website, and in some cases they might have recently gotten more internet savvy or more digital access.
On the flip side, this seems like a big endeavor, especially if you're used to applications and paper forms. Do you have any suggestions on get started, how to get people internally moving forward with this type of endeavor?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is, everybody wants to improve, for the constituents. And these are, government employees that, enjoy serving. I'm, always pleasantly surprised, not really pleasantly surprised, but I'm always happy when I see how much they really care about, their constituents and serving and improving their particular, agencies and interactions. I mean, I generally, have positive interactions when it comes into, hey, we're trying to make this simpler for everybody, cut down on accuracy. In fact, a lot of times what happens is when we improve this, employees can go and have more free time to improve other items in their agencies and departments.
Yeah, I think it goes back to user-centered design principles, and I think maybe some people may be like, oh, that's not my job because that's in design. That's totally not true. Anyone can really think about these different concepts. And I think that's what's so intriguing about just what we've talked about today. And Greg and I have worked very closely together on a lot of these processes, and I think that, the 6 core action types that we identified, that, everything kind of comes back to that. And I think this idea that design is only for people who do design, that's not true. I want to break down that barrier and just say, if you even are interested in it, just start thinking about it, and that will kind of get the ball rolling in starting processes and making change institutionally.
And having champions and advocates. So we've been fortunate in some of the cities we work with that you do have certain agencies and influential figures with the client that help move things along. And I think, currently the agencies handle their own items anyway, and obviously providing them resources to improve and assist in providing them some of our experiences and knowledge from doing this, it is generally well received, and I think everyone wants to make humanity better.
I like that sentiment, just having a constituent transparency for the greater good, but also you don't have to be a designer, you don't have to be a front end web developer. You can do this just on your own time and look at what you're currently doing.
In some cases, they already do it. They already manage their own agency content, and they put the PDF stuff and things like that. So it's really just taking the next step and using some of these best practices.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think we are ready to wrap up. Everyone out there, thank you for spending your time with us. We hope we walked you through some great best practices in terms of content design and how to digitize your services. Please watch your email for the on-demand recording of this video to share with your colleagues. And please visit thecitybase.com for details about upcoming webinars.